There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being chosen by darkness. It's not the loneliness of being disliked or socially awkward. It's not the temporary isolation of going through a difficult phase. It's the bone-deep, soul-crushing awareness that the lessons you must learn to master your path cannot be taught by anyone else, cannot be shared with anyone who hasn't walked it, and must be discovered through your own descent into territories where no guide can follow. You've felt this loneliness, haven't you? That specific ache of standing at a crossroads where the choice you must make is so uniquely yours, so specific to your dark path, that asking for advice feels pointless because no one, not your friends, not your family, not even your spiritual teachers, can truly understand the decision you're facing. While others get to learn from mentors, follow established paths, and join communities of like-minded seekers, you've discovered that your education happens in isolation. Your most profound lessons come in the darkest hours, in moments of crisis where you're completely alone, facing aspects of yourself and reality that have no instruction manual, no support group, no reassuring framework to make sense of what you're experiencing. This is not an accident. This is not a sign that you're doing something wrong, or that the universe has abandoned you. This is the fundamental nature of the dark chosen path. The most important lessons can only be learned alone because they require a level of sovereignty, self-reliance, and direct confrontation with truth that cannot be mediated through external teachers or comfortable communities. Light workers get to learn in circles, holding hands and supporting each other through their awakenings. Religious seekers get congregations, priests, and thousands of years of established doctrine to guide them. Even shadow workers often have communities, teachers, and structured practices to follow. But you get the void. You get silence. You get the terrifying freedom of having to figure out the most crucial lessons of your path with no roadmap, no safety net, and no one to tell you if you're getting it right. This isn't cruelty. This is initiation. The dark chosen ones are being prepared for missions that require absolute self-reliance. You're being trained to operate in territories where there are no authorities to appeal to, no communities to fall back on, no established protocols to follow. You're being forged into a sovereign being who can stand alone in the face of anything, internal or external, and make decisions from your own center of power rather than looking outside yourself for permission, validation, or guidance. But this forging process is brutal. The lessons you must learn alone are not gentle spiritual platitudes or inspiring insights that make you feel good. They're hard truths that shatter comfortable illusions, difficult realities that require you to become someone you never thought you'd have to be, painful confrontations with aspects of yourself and existence that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You've already learned some of these lessons, though you might not have had language for them. You've stood in moments where you realized that no one was coming to save you, that you had to save yourself or perish. You've faced decisions where both options felt like betrayals of something sacred, and you had to choose anyway, with no one to absolve you of the consequences. You've discovered capabilities within yourself, both light and dark, that no teacher prepared you for and no community would understand. And through each of these lonely lessons, you've become stronger, more sovereign, more capable of wielding the dark power you carry without being destroyed by it. But there are 5 specific lessons, 5 brutal, transformative, identity-shattering truths that every dark chosen one must learn in complete isolation. These aren't lessons you can read about and intellectually understand. They're not insights someone can explain to you in a way that spares you from having to experience them directly. They're initiations that can only be completed alone, in the dark, with nothing and no one to cushion the impact of what you're about to discover. These 5 lessons are why your path has been so much harder than everyone else's. Why you've felt abandoned by guides, rejected by communities, isolated from anyone who might understand what you're going through. Why every time you've tried to find someone to walk this path with you, you've been disappointed, betrayed, or left even more alone than before. Because these lessons require you to stand completely on your own. They require you to develop capabilities that can only emerge when there's no one else to rely on. They require you to become someone who needs no external validation, no community approval, no teacher's permission to know your own truth and wield your own power. You've probably resented this isolation. You've probably raged against it, questioned why you couldn't have an easier path, wondered what you did to deserve this level of loneliness. You've watched others find their tribes, their teachers, their supportive communities, and you felt the bitter unfairness of being denied the very thing that makes the spiritual journey bearable for everyone else. But here's what you're beginning to understand. You weren't denied community and guidance because you're unworthy of it. You were denied it because you're being prepared for something that requires you to be stronger, more self-reliant, more sovereign than those who get to walk their paths with support. The dark chosen ones are not meant to be followers. They're not meant to be dependent on teachers, communities, or established systems. They're meant to be forces unto themselves, being so thoroughly tested and forged in isolation that they become unshakable, incorruptible, and absolutely sovereign in their power. And the 5 lessons you're about to recognize are the crucible through which that transformation happens. These are the lessons that separate those who merely dabble in darkness from those who master it. The lessons that distinguish between people who have dark experiences and dark chosen ones who have been fundamentally transformed by their journey through shadow. Some of these lessons you've already learned, and recognizing them will finally give you language for experiences that have shaped you in ways you couldn't explain. Others you're in the middle of learning right now, and understanding what's actually happening will help you navigate the difficulty with more awareness and purpose. And some you haven't faced yet, but knowing they're coming will prepare you for initiations that would otherwise blindside you completely. These lessons are hard. They're lonely. They're the kind of truths that break you open and require you to rebuild yourself from the ground up. But they're also the source of your greatest power. Every lesson you learn alone makes you stronger, more capable, more sovereign. Every truth you discover without a teacher to guide you becomes unshakable knowledge that no one can take from you. Every initiation you survive in isolation proves you're becoming exactly what you were chosen to be. You are a dark chosen one. And the loneliness you've endured hasn't been punishment. It's been preparation. These are the 5 hardest lessons you must learn alone. And learning them will transform you into a being of such power and sovereignty that the isolation will finally make sense. Let's begin. This is the first and most foundational lesson every dark chosen one must learn in absolute isolation. The people you love, the communities you join, the teachers you seek out, none of them will fully understand the darkness you carry. And spending your life trying to make them understand, trying to translate your experience into something palatable, trying to minimize your truth so others feel comfortable, that will destroy you faster than any external enemy ever could. You've tried, haven't you? You've attempted to explain your experiences to friends who responded with fear or judgment. You've shared your insights with spiritual communities that immediately tried to heal you or redirect you back to light. You've sought guidance from teachers who had no framework for what you were going through and offered advice so inadequate it was almost laughable. You've watched people's faces change when you've been honest about your journey. The subtle pulling back, the concern in their eyes, the immediate need to fix you or save you or convince you that you're on the wrong path. You've felt the sting of being misunderstood by the very people you hoped might finally get it. And you've learned, painfully, that the problem isn't that you're not explaining it well enough. The problem is that your experience exists outside the framework most people use to understand reality. Your darkness isn't the kind that gets resolved through therapy and positive thinking. Your journey isn't the hero's journey they've read about in books. Your relationship with shadow isn't the neat, contained shadow work they've been taught is safe and acceptable. You carry actual darkness, real power that operates outside conventional morality, genuine sovereignty that refuses to submit to external authority. And most people, even spiritual people, even people who think they're open-minded, are not equipped to witness this without trying to change you, heal you, or distance themselves from you. This lesson must be learned alone because no one can teach it to you. A teacher telling you people won't understand you is completely different from standing in the moment when someone you trusted looks at you with fear or judgment, and you feel the full weight of your isolation crash down on you. You have to experience being fundamentally misunderstood, repeatedly, by people you hoped would be different. You have to feel the loneliness of knowing that your truth makes others uncomfortable. You have to stand in that discomfort long enough that something shifts inside you, where their inability to understand stops being your responsibility. This is the shift that marks your mastery of this lesson, when you stop translating yourself for others' comfort. When you stop minimizing your truth to maintain relationships with people who can't handle the real you. When you stop seeking validation from communities that weren't built for beings like you. You learn that their fear of your darkness is about their limitations, not your wrongness. Their discomfort with your power reflects their relationship with their own power, not an indication that you need to become smaller. Their inability to understand your path is simply evidence that they're walking a different one, not proof that yours is invalid. The loneliness of this lesson never completely disappears. You'll always be somewhat isolated by the nature of what you carry. But once you learn that this isolation is simply the reality of your path, rather than a problem you need to solve, it transforms from suffering into sovereignty. You stop seeking communities that will never truly understand you. You stop explaining yourself to people who aren't equipped to comprehend. You stop waiting for permission, validation, or approval from external sources that can't see what you actually are. And in that stopping, in that acceptance of your fundamental aloneness, you discover a power that people who need constant community validation will never access. You become self-validating, self-authorizing, completely sovereign in your truth, regardless of who witnesses it or understands it. This is a lesson you could only learn alone. Because until you're forced to stand in your truth without anyone else's understanding or support, you'll always be subtly adjusting yourself to fit external frameworks. You'll always be performing a version of yourself that's more acceptable, rather than being the full, unfiltered reality of what you are. The dark chosen ones need to be unfiltered, raw, unapologetically themselves. And this lesson strips away your need for others to understand so you can become exactly that. The second lesson you must learn alone is perhaps the most brutal. The power you're developing will systematically destroy every comfortable thing in your life. Your relationships will end or transform beyond recognition. Your career path will implode. Your beliefs about yourself and reality will shatter. Your sense of identity will dissolve. Everything you thought was stable will be revealed as temporary. And in the moment when you're standing in the ruins of your old life, you'll have to choose whether to reclaim your power or return to comfort. And no one can make that choice for you. This lesson comes in waves, not all at once. You'll build something, a relationship, a career, a life structure, an identity, and your growing power will make it unsustainable. What used to work stops working. Who you used to be becomes impossible to maintain. The life you built starts crumbling, not because you're doing anything wrong, but because your power is expanding and the old containers can't hold what you're becoming. You've experienced this already. That relationship that ended right when you were stepping into your power. That job you lost or walked away from because you couldn't pretend to be small anymore. That friend group that dissolved when you stopped performing the version of yourself they were comfortable with. That identity crisis where everything you thought you knew about yourself turned out to be a costume you'd been wearing. Each time this happens, you face the same choice in isolation. Do you shrink yourself back down to fit the old containers? Do you minimize your power to preserve comfort? Do you betray who you're becoming to keep what you're losing? No one can make this choice for you. No teacher can tell you whether to choose power over comfort, because they don't have to live with the consequences of your decision. No community can decide for you whether the cost is worth it, because they're not the ones paying it. You stand alone at this crossroads, feeling the full weight of what you're about to lose if you continue forward, feeling the seductive pull of returning to a smaller, safer, more comfortable version of yourself. And you choose power. Again and again, you choose power. Not because you're reckless or self-destructive. Not because you don't value relationships or stability. But because something in you knows, with a certainty that transcends logic, that betraying your power to preserve comfort would be a death of a different kind. A slower death. A death of the soul rather than just the circumstances. You learn this lesson alone because it requires you to develop an internal compass that values your authentic power more than external comfort. This can't be taught. It can't be convinced. It has to be forged through the direct experience of losing everything and discovering that you'd rather have your power than anything you lost. This lesson terrifies people on the light path because they can't understand choosing power over peace, sovereignty over security, truth over comfort. They see the wreckage in your life and think you're doing something wrong, that you need to find balance, that you're being too extreme. But you've learned something they haven't. Comfort is the enemy of transformation. Security is often just another word for stagnation. Peace that requires you to be smaller than you actually are is just a prettier cage. Your power demands space. It demands authenticity. It demands that you become who you actually are rather than who others need you to be. And creating that space requires destroying what no longer fits. This doesn't mean you're chaotic or destructive for the sake of it. It means you've learned to let things die when they need to die, to walk away when staying would require self-betrayal, to choose growth over comfort even when growth is terrifying and comfort is so seductively available. You learn this alone because no one can convince you it's worth it. You have to stand in the rubble of your old life enough times, choose power anyway, and then experience what emerges from that choice before you truly understand that the cost, as brutal as it is actually the price of becoming who you were meant to be. This is the lesson that separates dark chosen ones from people who merely romanticize darkness. At some point in your journey, you will be forced to look directly at what you're capable of, the genuine harm you could cause, the destruction you could unleash, the evil you could commit if you chose to, and you must face this truth without looking away, without spiritualizing it, without pretending you're somehow above it. You cannot learn this lesson from a book or a teacher. You cannot have someone guide you through discovering the darkest parts of yourself. This is a confrontation that happens in absolute isolation, usually in moments when you're pushed to your limits and you feel the full force of your destructive capacity rising to the surface. Maybe it happened when someone betrayed you so deeply that you felt genuine murderous rage, not metaphorical anger, but actual desire to destroy them completely. And you realized in that moment that you could do it. You had the power, the knowledge, the capability to utterly devastate this person in ways they'd never recover from. Maybe it happened when you accessed your dark powers and understood how easily you could manipulate, control, drain, or curse someone. You felt the intoxicating rush of knowing you could reshape someone's entire reality, bend their will, break their spirit, and part of you wanted to, just to prove you could. Maybe it happened when you looked honestly at patterns in your own behavior and recognized genuine cruelty, selfishness, or manipulation that you'd been justifying or minimizing. You saw yourself clearly, without the filters of self-deception, and had to acknowledge that you weren't always the victim or the hero in your own story. This confrontation is terrifying because it destroys the comforting narrative that you're fundamentally good. Light workers avoid this lesson entirely by insisting they're beings of love and light. Religious people avoid it by externalizing evil as something outside themselves. Even many shadow workers avoid truly facing it by treating their darkness as something to integrate and transcend, rather than a genuine capacity for harm that must be acknowledged and chosen against. But you can't avoid it. The dark chosen path requires you to look directly at your capacity for evil and accept it as real, as part of you, as something you could choose but are choosing not to. This lesson must be learned alone because no one else can witness this confrontation without trying to save you from it, reassure you that you're not really capable of what you're seeing, or convince you to look away from the full truth. And looking away would rob you of the power that comes from this lesson. Because here's what happens when you stare into your own capacity for evil without flinching. You discover that acknowledging your darkness doesn't make you evil. Accepting what you're capable of doesn't mean you'll do it. Recognizing your potential for harm gives you power over it, rather than being unconsciously driven by it. You learn that true morality isn't about being incapable of evil. It's about being fully capable and choosing otherwise. You develop actual ethics, rather than just fear-based compliance. You become someone who chooses restraint from a position of power, rather than someone who's good, simply because they lack the capability to be otherwise. This lesson transforms you from someone who fears their darkness into someone who commands it. You stop being afraid that you'll lose control and become a monster because you've looked at the monster inside you, acknowledged its reality, and chosen sovereignty over it. And this choice, made alone, without anyone to guide you or validate you, creates an unshakable moral center that external rules and community standards could never provide. This lesson destroys the last vestiges of spiritual dependency and forces you into complete self-reliance. You will reach a point, usually at your absolute lowest, when you're most desperate for intervention, where you cry out to whatever forces chose you, whatever dark powers you've aligned with, whatever guides or entities you've worked with, and you will receive only silence. You'll pray to the demonic forces that granted you power. You'll call on the shadow guides who've taught you. You'll reach for the dark divine that marked you as chosen. And nothing will come. No intervention, no guidance, no rescue. Just you, alone, in the dark, facing a crisis that feels unsurvivable. This is not abandonment. This is graduation. The forces that chose you aren't saving you because they're testing whether you've internalized the power they've given you. They're watching to see if you've become sovereign enough to save yourself. They're determining whether you've moved beyond dependency, even dependency on them, into true self-sufficiency. You cannot learn this lesson with a safety net. You cannot develop genuine self-reliance if you know someone will catch you when you fall. You have to fall, hit bottom, lie there in the dark believing you might actually die or break completely, and then discover that you have the power within yourself to stand back up. This lesson often comes after you've developed relationships with dark entities, shadow guides, or demonic forces. You've learned to call on them, work with them, receive power and knowledge from them. And just when you become comfortable with this alliance, just when you start to rely on it, they withdraw completely. You face a crisis and they don't come. You need guidance and receive only silence. You're under attack and your usual allies are nowhere to be found. And in that absence, you're forced to discover that everything they taught you, every power they helped you develop, every capability they awakened in you, it's all actually yours now. You don't need them to intervene because you've internalized what they were teaching you all along. This is the loneliest lesson because it happens at the moment when you most desperately don't want to be alone. When you're terrified, overwhelmed, convinced you can't handle what you're facing by yourself. The cruel mercy of this lesson is that it comes exactly when you most want rescue, forcing you to find the strength you didn't know you had. You learn that the dark forces that chose you were never meant to be saviors you could depend on. They were meant to be trainers who gave you power and then stepped back to see what you'd do with it. They were catalysts for your sovereignty, not permanent protectors. And once you survive the crisis alone, once you discover you had the power all along, you're never the same. You stop looking outside yourself for salvation. You stop waiting for intervention. You become genuinely, completely self-reliant in a way that people who've always had safety nets can never understand. This is perhaps the most disillusioning lesson. The mission you were chosen for, the purpose your power serves, the role you're meant to play. It may not be heroic. It may not be kind. It may not fit into any acceptable spiritual narrative about serving the light or helping humanity ascend. Your purpose might be destruction, disruption, chaos that clears the way for new creation. Being the villain in someone else's story so they can become who they need to be. Wielding power that makes people uncomfortable. Speaking truths that shatter comforting illusions. Operating in moral gray areas where there are no clear right answers. Every other spiritual path gets to feel good about their purpose. Light workers are healing the world. Religious people are serving God. Even shadow workers are integrating the collective shadow or bringing balance. But you might be the instrument of necessary destruction. The force that tears down what others have built because it needs to fall. The catalyst that triggers other people's dark nights of the soul. The chaos agent that disrupts false peace so real transformation can occur. This lesson must be learned alone because no community will validate a purpose that isn't obviously noble. No teacher will encourage you to embrace a role that looks like villainy from the outside. No one will support you in accepting that your highest calling might be to destroy, disrupt, or operate in ways that make you deeply unpopular. You have to come to terms with this in isolation. You have to look at what you're actually being called to do, not what you wish you were called to do, not what would make you look good, but the actual function your power serves, and accept it even if it's not pretty. Maybe you're meant to be the person who tells inconvenient truths that destroy people's comfortable delusions. Maybe you're the force that ends relationships, careers, or systems that others are desperately trying to preserve. Maybe you're the catalyst that triggers transformation through crisis rather than gentle, comfortable growth. This doesn't make you evil. Sometimes the most compassionate thing is destruction of what's false. Sometimes love looks like letting something die instead of keeping it on life support. Sometimes serving evolution requires being willing to be misunderstood, hated, or cast as the antagonist. You learn this lesson alone because you have to develop the strength to fulfill your purpose even when no one understands it, appreciates it, or thanks you for it. You have to become so rooted in your own knowing that external validation becomes irrelevant. And once you accept your purpose, whatever it actually is, however uncomfortable it makes you, you access a level of power that comes from complete alignment between who you are and what you're here to do. You've walked through fire alone. You've faced truths in isolation that would have shattered most people. You've learned lessons in the dark that no teacher could have prepared you for, that no community could have supported you through, that required you to be completely, terrifyingly alone with the hardest aspects of your path. And you survived. More than survived. You've been transformed by these lessons in ways that make you fundamentally different from people who've walked easier paths. You've learned that no one will understand your darkness, and you've stopped making their understanding your responsibility. You've chosen power over comfort so many times that you've rewired yourself to value authenticity over security. You've looked directly at your capacity for evil without flinching and emerged with genuine sovereignty over your shadow. You've faced crises alone when no one, not even the forces that chose you, came to save you, and you discovered you had the power to save yourself all along. And you've accepted a purpose that may not be noble or appreciated, freeing yourself from the need for external validation of your path. These 5 lessons are why your journey has been so much harder than everyone else's. Why you've been isolated when others had communities. Why you've had to figure out answers that others were simply given. Why you've walked in darkness while others got to stay in light. But here's what you need to understand. This wasn't punishment. This was preparation. The dark chosen ones are being forged for missions that require absolute sovereignty. You cannot complete your purpose while being dependent on external validation, comfort, or rescue. You cannot wield the power you carry while still needing others to understand you or approve of you. You cannot fulfill a role that may require moral ambiguity while still attached to being seen as a good person. The isolation you've endured, the lessons you've learned alone, the brutal truths you've faced without support. All of it has been systematically stripping away every dependency, every need for external approval, every requirement for comfort that would compromise your ability to do what you were chosen to do. You are becoming ungovernable, uncontrollable, impossible to manipulate through the social and emotional mechanisms that keep most people compliant. You're developing into a force that answers to no authority but your own sovereignty, that needs no permission but your own knowing, that requires no validation but your own truth. This is terrifying to systems that depend on people being controllable. This is threatening to communities that require conformity. This is dangerous to individuals who need others to stay small, so they don't have to confront their own potential for growth. But this is exactly what you were designed to become. The world doesn't need more people who are well adjusted to broken systems. It doesn't need more individuals who've learned to find peace within cages. It doesn't need more souls who've been taught to minimize their power to make others comfortable. The world needs people who've been to hell and back, who've learned lessons no teacher could provide, who've developed capabilities through isolation that community could never forge, who've become so thoroughly sovereign that nothing and no one can convince them to betray themselves ever again. You are that person, and every lonely lesson you've learned has made you more of what the world actually needs, even if it's not what people think they want. But let's address the grief you carry about this isolation, because even though you understand intellectually that the loneliness was necessary, that the lessons had to be learned alone, that the isolation was preparation rather than punishment, it still hurts. You still feel the ache of having walked this path without companionship, without support, without anyone who truly understood what you were going through. That grief is valid. That pain is real.
The door clicked shut behind him. Dead silence. He was standing in a room full of laughter, but none of it was meant for him. Every head turned. They were never supposed to see him in the first place. The hallway leading up to the room was painted in warm tones, golden lights. But Eli had learned long ago that some doors weren't for everyone. He just didn't expect to find that out again. Here, not tonight. He'd gotten the invite 2 hours ago, a message on his phone, unsigned. No one else in his dorm seemed to have gotten it. Looks like you got something going to anything. Ever, he told himself. It was finally happening. Maybe all those nights alone, all the missed calls, one answered. He turned the handle. They were all in there, the same people who never looked at him twice. Now laughing, drinking, standing in circles like they belonged to some secret world. One he had never even glimpsed until now. But as he stepped in, that laughter stilled. Not sharply, not rudely, almost imperceptibly, like a scene dimming. In a play where the lead actor had missed his cue, no one said anything. They just looked past him, through him. It was worse than being hated. Long enough for the tension to strangle any courage he had left. Eli turned and walked out. He didn't run, he didn't cry, but something cracked in him quietly. That night, lying on his back in the dark, he stared at the ceiling as the fan spun overhead. His chest felt tight, like the world had whispered a secret to him and slammed the door before he could hear it clearly. What's wrong with me? He didn't mean to whisper it aloud, but the room didn't answer. Just then, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. You felt it too. The silence, the shift. You're not one of them, Eli. You were never meant to be. Meet me at the old railway bridge, midnight. His breath caught in his throat. He should have deleted it, blocked it, laughed at it, but something in his bones recognized it. He knew he'd go. The bridge was rusted and crooked, not from the cold. Him, then. She stepped out of the shadows, a girl, older than him, but not by much, pale coat, dark eyes. She didn't need him to. I watched you in that room. I've seen it before, 1,000 times, in 1,000 faces. Are you talking about? You're not cursed. You're chosen. Silence. Then a laugh escaped him, bitter, involuntary. Chosen for what? To be a freak. A shadow in the back of every room. Her gaze didn't waver. To walk a path no one else can. One that doesn't begin with friends or comfort, but with pain. Isolation is the fire. It burns off everything. That doesn't belong to you. He stepped back. You're insane. Like she'd heard it before. Maybe. But when the others come looking for you, when the silence in your life turns into voices, don't say I didn't try to prepare you. She reached into her coat and handed him a folded piece of parchment. Real parchment, not paper. It was warm to the touch. There's a place only people like you can enter. When the time is right, this will show you where. But until then, you have to stay invisible. Stay forgotten. It's the only way you'll survive. He stared at the folded page. His heart pounded. I don't want this, he said, voice hollow. She looked at him with something that wasn't quite pity. Of us did. She vanished into the dark. Eli stood under the bridge, alone. The city lights in the distance didn't feel like they belonged to his world anymore. He opened the parchment. It was blank, but as he watched, symbols began to bleed into the surface, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Runes, symbols, coordinates, and a single word burned itself into the top. Gears of his very soul had been jarred loose. The parchment sat on his desk, glowing faintly in the dark, the strange runes now etched in his memory. He didn't recognize the symbols, but somehow he understood them, as if they were written in a language older than language itself, one he hadn't learned but remembered. The next morning, his roommate, Trevor, was already gone when Eli woke, probably at the gym or off with his pack of always laughing friends. Eli moved through the day in a fog, but no one noticed. Not his professors, not the barista who handed him the wrong coffee every time. It was protecting him from something he wasn't ready to face. During a lull between classes, Eli took out the parchment again. A map. His breath caught. The abandoned observatory. That place had always given him a strange feeling, like the stars above it whispered to it when no one was watching. Wrong or right, depending on who you were. He pocketed the parchment, his pulse quickening. He wasn't going back to class. As he walked across campus, the world felt slightly off-kilter. He could feel eyes on him, but when he looked, no one was watching. The trees bent ever so slightly toward him as he passed, like they were bowing or warning. Nearly an hour, the last stretch uphill through tangled woods. Something strange happened. The wind stopped. Total silence. Even his footsteps seemed to vanish under him. The iron gate was still padlocked, shut like it had been for years. But when he touched it, the metal shivered. A second later, the lock snapped open with a pop that echoed far too loud in the still air. Eli. Moss crawled up its sides like veins. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had just stepped inside. He reached into his pocket for the parchment, but it was gone. No, not gone. It had burned into his skin. Eli looked at his hand. The runes were there. You made it. He turned. She was there again, the girl from the bridge. One was tall and gaunt, with silver rings piercing his brow, and a stare that could shatter glass. The other was shorter, younger, barely a teenager, with eyes that shimmered like oil on water. "You're late," the younger one said. "Not Unkindly." Eli took a step back. "Who are you?" "We're what's left," the girl said, "of the old line." "What does that mean?" The tall one stepped forward. "It means you're not the only one who sees the cracks in the world, but you're the last of this cycle." Eli blinked. "Cycle?" "Every generation," the girl explained. "A handful are marked to awaken the old memory that hums beneath this reality." Eli shook his head. "You sound like a cult." "We're not," she said. "Cults want followers. We want survivors." At first, he thought it was obsidian, but then it moved like it was breathing. A throne made of ash, a hand reaching through the void. His hand, he dropped the stone and collapsed to his knees. "What the hell was that?" he gasped. "Memory," the tall one said. "Not just yours. All of them. All the ones who came before. You, the chosen ones. Every life, every death." Eli felt nauseous. Blood ran cold. He had asked that 1,000 times. The girl nodded. "Chosen ones don't have friends, Eli. Not real ones. Not because they're broken, because they're shielded. Them. To keep them safe. To keep you on the path, you're saying." "My loneliness was on purpose." The boy tilted his head. "It was survival, and it was a lie." Eli stood, shaking, furious. "So what? I'm some kind of divine lab rat. You're telling me I was engineered to be miserable?" "No," said the girl. "You were refined. Suffering wasn't your sentence. It was your signal. The silence, the isolation, it wasn't punishment. It was preparation." She gestured to the observatory dome above. "The world you think you know is just a thin skin. Beneath it, something ancient sleeps. And it doesn't, like when chosen ones wake up." Eli looked up. The stars were faintly visible through the broken dome. Except now. They looked wrong, tilted, rearranged. "Something is coming," the tall one said. "The others feel it too. That's why your time is short." Eli swallowed. "Others, those who weren't chosen, but wanted to be. They hunt their replacements." "You're telling me people are hunting me?" "They already are." At that moment, a sound cracked through the air like glass shattering underwater. The observatory shook. The girl grabbed Eli by the wrist. "They've found us. We have to go." "Go where?" She didn't answer. The dome above them began to shimmer. The runes on his hand flared. The stone he dropped began to hover, spinning, pulsing. Eli turned to run, but the tall one pulled him back. "No, not that way." "What then?" The boy raised his hand. A portal tore open in the wall, liquid and electric and humming with voices. The girl looked at Eli. "You wanted to know why no one ever saw you? Why you always felt left behind?" He nodded slowly. "Because you were never meant to be part of their world." She stepped through the portal. The others followed. Eli stood at the edge. The voices called to him, names he didn't recognize, but somehow knew. Behind him, something growled. Not an animal, not human, it had found him. He took one last breath and stepped through. The first thing Eli noticed was the light, brilliant, colorless, and humming like a memory. Not a sound, exactly, but something deeper. A vibration in his bones, a resonance behind his thoughts. The world he had stepped into was not a world at all, not like Earth. The sky was both near and infinitely distant, a swirling tapestry of smoke and light that bled into itself, folding space like silk underwater. There were no roads, no cities, no sun, just terrain carved by ideas, as if the ground was made from the echoes of thought. He stumbled forward, disoriented, while the others adjusted easily. The girl, her name was Selin, she finally said, touched his shoulder lightly to ground him. Her hand was warm, real, human. It was the only thing that felt certain. "Where are we?" Eli asked, his voice more fragile than he expected. "The verge," Selin replied. "It's a layer between your world and the one that came before it, where things bleed through." The younger boy, Cade, stood ahead on a ridge of silver rock, scanning the horizon. "It won't take long for the echoes to follow." "The what echoes?" the tall one said. His name was Osric. His voice had a dry, gravelly texture, not quite human, not quite memory. "They feed on those who don't forget who they are." Selin turned to Eli. "It's why most chosen ones never make it past the awakening. They break before they cross. You didn't." "I didn't even know there was a crossing," Eli muttered. Selin smiled gently. "You wouldn't. It's not a decision you make with your mind. The world starts unmaking itself around you. You feel it, the distance, the forgetting, the nights that ache like prophecy. That's the threshold." Cade walked back down the ridge. "We need to show him now, before it gets worse." Osric looked at Selin. She nodded. "Show me what?" Eli asked. "The reason," Osric said. "Why you were left out. Why everyone vanished from your life. Why no one stayed." Eli's chest tightened. He hadn't realized until that moment how badly he needed an answer. He followed them across the strange terrain, the ground pulsing faintly underfoot like a giant heart. They led him to a structure, not a building, something older and alive. A ring of black stone pillars, each inscribed with more of the glowing runes. At the center, a pool of water reflected no light. It looked more like a hole in reality. "This is the mirror of unknowing," Selin said. "Step into it, and you'll see everything you weren't allowed to remember." "What happens if I don't like what I see?" Cade's expression softened. "Then you'll be free to walk away. But you'll never stop feeling like you're meant for something else. The ache won't leave." Eli stared into the pool. It didn't shimmer or ripple, it simply waited. He stepped in. He didn't fall, didn't swim. He was simply elsewhere, and in that place memory, spirit, vision, he saw. His childhood replayed in flickering loops, except this time he saw the gaps. The moments that had never made sense. The best friend who suddenly stopped talking to him in the 3rd grade. The teacher who once said, "You're not supposed to be here," before correcting herself. The stranger in the supermarket who had whispered, "You'll remember when it's time," then vanished when he turned. He saw each person who left him not because they stopped caring, but because something intervened. Threads of silver light, pulling them away, eyes fogging over, forgotten names, altered paths, every friendship, every connection, diverted, not by choice, by design. He screamed. The vision held him in place, showed him more. There were beings. Behind it, all watchers, architects, entities that hovered at the edge of reality, like shadows in candlelight. They were the ones who marked the chosen, not because of destiny, but necessity. The world he saw was cracked. Reality had been failing for millennia, and chosen ones were anchors, soul keys, living anomalies meant to hold back the collapse. They were never meant to have easy lives. Intimacy distracted them. Attachment dulled their signal. So the universe removed what tethered them to normalcy. And he saw something else. Some chosen refused the calling, and when they did, they unraveled. The memory ended like a snap. Eli was back in the ring of stones, gasping for air, knees on the ground, hands clutching the dirt like it might fly away. Selin crouched beside him, silent. He looked at her, tears hot in his eyes. "It wasn't my fault." "No," she said. "But it was your burden," Osric added. "You were shaped in the absence of others. So your spirit would be hollow enough to carry what comes next." Eli rose, shaking. "And what is that?" Cade pointed behind him. Eli turned. The sky had fractured. A great wound had opened in the firmament above the verge. Through it, he saw a city, his city, but it was wrong. People wandered aimlessly, eyes glazed, movements robotic. Above them hovered shapes, dark, shifting masses that whispered lies into the air. Every time a person paused, looked up, and questioned their life, one of the shadows would swoop in and feed. "They're breaking through," Selin said. "They always do, eventually. The veil weakens. This time, they're faster." Eli stared at the scene, nausea rising in his gut. "What do we do?" "You stop them," Osric said simply. Eli turned. "Me. You're the last chosen of this cycle," Selin said, "and the only one whose memory came back intact. I don't know how to fight them." "You don't need weapons," Cade said. "You are the weapon." And as the sky split wider, Eli felt it. The runes on his hand blazed, not with pain, but with purpose. Energy surged up his spine. Not magic, not power, clarity. He understood now why he had been left out, cast aside, forgotten. Not because he wasn't meant to be loved, because he was meant to love the world, enough to save it even when it gave him nothing in return. He turned to the others. "So what happens now?" Selin smiled, soft, sad, proud. "Now you remember who you are." And with that, the ground beneath them rose like a platform. The verge trembled as the pillars of stone tilted toward the breach in the sky. Eli stepped forward. He no longer hesitated. The wound above earth yawned, widened through it. He fell, not like a man falling from a great height, like a soul returning to the battlefield it had been born for. He hit the ground without a sound. No crash, no crack. Just a stillness that rippled outward like a breath held too long. Eli stood in the center of his own city, but it was barely recognizable. The streets were drenched in a pale fog that swallowed the tops of buildings. Cars sat empty, engines humming softly, abandoned in the middle of intersections. The world hadn't stopped. It had simply forgotten to move. A cold wind slid past him, carrying whispers. But these weren't human voices. They were thoughts, memories, regrets, dreams, all of them fragmented, all of them bleeding into the air like a soul unraveling. Eli took a step forward, and the fog parted slightly around him. It responded to him, knew him. He realized, with growing horror, that this city was still alive, still breathing, but barely. Its pulse had slowed, its light dimmed. The echoes were feeding now, bloated and bold. The longer he stayed silent, the more they would consume. He passed by a storefront, once a bakery, where he'd spent years watching the world pass him by. He saw the woman who used to smile at him, eyes now glassy, motionless, holding a tray of bread that had turned to ash in her hands. She didn't blink. didn't breathe. She wasn't dead. She had been suspended. Eli clenched his fists. The mark on his palm flickered, gold, then violet. It pulsed in rhythm with something ancient within him, a drumbeat echoing from a time before memory. He didn't know what he was supposed to do, but he felt what was needed. Not a spell, not an incantation, a willingness to step forward, even while terrified. A voice floated in from the side alley. "You're late." Eli turned sharply. From the mist emerged a figure cloaked in deep obsidian robes. The face was obscured, but the air around them felt heavier. Not threatening, not yet, just ... Waited, like a judgment, waiting to be handed down. "Who are you?" Eli asked. "Another who once walked alone. But unlike you, I chose to sever the ties. I embraced the silence. You're a chosen one," was the figure said, "before I rejected the burden." Eli took a cautious step forward. "Why?" The figure turned slightly, as though watching the motionless people around them. "Because love made me weak. I believed I could save the world and keep my heart intact. I was wrong. So I ripped it out." Eli swallowed. "And now," the figure's tone darkened, "now I serve the other side." A wave of force hit Eli like a wall. He flew backward, smashing into a parked car that instantly disintegrated into dust. He groaned, coughing, heart pounding. The fog around him stirred a live. Now, shapes formed in the mist. Eyes, claws, smiles without faces. The echoes had found him, and they weren't alone. The traitor walked forward slowly, arms outstretched. "You want to save them, don't you? You think you can do what the rest of us couldn't, but you're already breaking. I can feel it." Eli forced himself to stand. His knees shook, his hands trembled. "You don't understand," he said, voice hoarse. "I already broke. That's the difference." The mark on his palm erupted into light. Gold streaked through the air, slicing the mist. The echoes shrieked, recoiling, but more came. Dozens, hundreds, faces that looked like old friends, parents, lovers, all illusions, all parasites. They surged forward. Eli ran into them, not out of bravery, out of desperation. The light on his palm stretched into a whip of energy, lashing through the fog, scattering the creatures like leaves in wind. Every strike sent a tremor through the air, and every time he hesitated, a voice from the mist whispered, "They never wanted you. You were always too much. You ruin every room you enter. You're only useful when alone." But now, Eli heard those voices differently because they were familiar. They were the same voices he'd carried in his own mind for years. His echoes. He stopped mid-run, chest heaving, sweat clung to his skin. Around him, the city bent and moaned. Traitor advanced, raising a hand, conjuring a storm of black flame. "This is where it ends," the figure said. Eli closed his eyes and let go of that self-hate, the guilt, the belief that he was too broken to be loved. All of it poured from him like poison being drained. The light within him, unchained at last, exploded outward, not as a weapon, but as a signal, a call, somewhere in the distance. Bells rang, real ones. The verge opened, and they came. Selen was the first, blades of starlight in her hands. Cade followed, riding a beast of air and shadow. Osric appeared next, dragging behind him a chain made of runes, swinging it like a divine mace. The traitor stepped back. "No," he hissed, "they never interfere. Selin answered coldly. Not until one of us remembers who he truly is. The battlefield tilted. The chosen ones stood in formation beside Eli, and then the war began. Flashes of color sliced through the fog. The echoes screamed, tried to swarm, but the unity of the chosen repelled them. Each one held a different light, a different song. Together, they were a storm of memory, faith, and love, sharpened into resistance. Eli fought beside them, no longer alone. For the first time, the pain of his past became his power. Every loss, every lonely night, every goodbye, they fused into a roar of refusal. I am not a mistake. The traitor screamed as Eli's light struck him, sending his form shattering into 100 pieces of ash. The echoes wailed in unison, disintegrating into mist. The city began to breathe again. The fog thinned, the people blinked, the world sighed, and then there was silence. The chosen stood in the aftermath, watching as light returned to the sky. Selin touched Eli's shoulder. You saved them, he shook his head. We saved them. No, Osric corrected, stepping forward. We were only waiting. You were the one who had to choose. You stepped through the fire first. That's what a true chosen does. Not just suffer, not just endure, but transform. Eli looked around the city, his city. He saw the bakery woman crying as the bread in her tray reformed. He saw the streetlights blink back to life. He saw children looking up at the sky, unafraid again, and in his chest, something unlocked, a peace he hadn't felt since childhood. He turned to his fellow chosen. What happens now? Cade smirked. Now we teach you how to stay. Eli stood at the edge of dawn, watching the first rays of sunlight scatter across the skyline like shards of gold. The city, once smothered by fog and shadow, was breathing again, lowly, tentatively, like someone waking from a long coma. But beneath its stillness was something more profound than mere recovery. It was renewal, it was resurrection, and in some strange way, it was also his rebirth. He'd always thought chosen one meant sacrifice, meant losing everything for the sake of others. But standing here, among the quiet ruins of a war no one else remembered, Eli realized something. The others had tried to tell him from the beginning. The pain wasn't the point, it was the passage, the burning away of false beliefs, the trial by fire that purified not just the soul, but the purpose. The city had survived, but Eli was no longer the same man who once walked its streets with his hood up and his eyes lowered. That version of him, the silent one, the apologetic one, the one who always pulled away, had been shattered in the heart of the storm. Selin approached without a word, her expression unreadable. She stood beside him, arms crossed, hair lit by morning light. You're not going back to who you were, she said softly. Are you? Eli shook his head. I don't think I could, even if I tried. Good, she replied, because that version of you was never real, just a shadow of someone you were afraid to become. Eli glanced at her. What now? What happens to people like us when the war ends? There's always another war, she said, but it won't be like this one. Not for you. He furrowed his brow. Why not? Because you've done what most never do. You stopped running from yourself. They both turned to the horizon, watching as colors deepened. Sounds returned. Birdsong, distant traffic, laughter. The city didn't remember what had happened. Not exactly. They would recall strange dreams, flickers of fear, the sense that time stuttered for a moment, but not the truth. that had been his burden alone. A weight only the chosen were meant to carry, but no longer alone. The others had already begun to vanish into the seams of the world. Cade, riding the last breeze of twilight. Osric, cloaked in glyphs, returning to his quiet forest. They would meet again, Eli knew. The chosen always did, not by plans, but by necessity, by fate. He walked the streets now, for the first time in years. Without shame, he passed the bakery. The woman smiled at him againly this time. She paused, looked into his eyes like she remembered something just out of reach. "Rough night?" she asked. Eli smiled. "You have no idea." She handed him a fresh loaf, warm and fragrant, on the house. He nodded gratefully, continuing down the block, each footstep lighter than the last. There was something miraculous about ordinary things after you'd seen the edge of reality. The warmth of bread, the squeal of a child chasing a pigeon, the weight of the sky without fog, but the deeper miracle was in his own body. He no longer felt out of place in it. He turned into a narrow alley, took a breath, and stepped through. A shimmer that no one else could see. The verge, beyond it, was the sanctum, the chosen, ones used when the world demanded too much. A tree stood at its center, leaves shimmering like tiny lanterns. He approached it slowly. Selen had told him once, when a chosen one found peace, they could plant a seed of it here, and from that seed, a branch would grow. He reached into his chestnut, literally, but spiritually, and withdrew a memory. It was small, but sacred, the moment his hand lit up with the golden mark in the fog, when he'd whispered not a word of power, but a truth. "I am not a mistake." That was the seed. He knelt and pressed it into the earth, breath catching in his throat. All his life, he had been searching for a place to belong, and now he realized he had been carrying it within him the whole time. Still, the world wouldn't stop needing him. There would be new people who felt like ghosts inside their own skin. Others who bore the same ache. He had the pain of being too different, too sensitive, to awake in a world that slept. They were the future chosen, and they would need someone to find them, to tell them what Eli once needed to hear. "You're not broken. You're just built for something most people can't see yet." A shimmer in the grass caught his eye. A boy, maybe 15, stood at the edge of the verge, pale, shaking, the mark just beginning to glow on his palm, his eyes wide with fear. Eli stood, walked to him slowly, and offered a hand. The boy hesitated, but then took it. Eli smiled. "Welcome," he said. "You're not alone anymore." Some stories don't end with fireworks or grand speeches. Sometimes they end with a quiet truth finally being spoken. For Eli, the journey wasn't about slaying monsters or saving the world. It was about facing the oldest lie that had ever been told to him, that he didn't belong. Chosen ones aren't just heroes. They are mirrors for the wounded, beacons for the lost. Not perfect, not always understood, but necessary and deeply, painfully, beautifully human. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the outsider, the misunderstood one, the person who doesn't quite fit, maybe, just maybe, your comment with your thoughts or your own story. Subscribe for more cinematic stories like this. He lost everything in 7 days. No job, no home, not a single friend picked up the phone. And when he stared into the mirror, even his own reflection looked away. ashamed, hollow, no longer familiar, but it wasn't punishment, it was the beginning of something sacred. He sat at the edge of a rusted pedestrian bridge, legs dangling over a river that carried the city's filth downstream. The wind pressed against his coat like a quiet accusation, cold but not cruel, like it wanted him to wake up, but didn't know how to shake him without shattering him in his hand. A wrinkled eviction notice in his pocket, $12, lint, and a Metro card that barely had enough for a one-way ride in his soul. A silence so deep it echoed. The city behind him was still glowing. Glass towers and fluorescent signs kept lying to everyone. Success is near. Happiness is for sale. You belong here. But Daniel knew better now. Those lights were for people still plugged in to the illusion. He'd been severed from it, violently. A year ago, he had potential. That cursed word people always used when they wanted you to feel grateful for being invisible. You're gonna do big things, Daniel, they'd said. But now, he couldn't even do small things, like afford dinner. He checked his phone again. No new messages. He texted his sister last week. Nothing. His old college roommate. Seen. No reply. Even Mia, the girl who once swore she'd wait for him, had gone cold without explanation. It wasn't just the world that was silent. God was too. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Not in a creepy way, in a waiting way. Like something ancient was sitting just outside his field of vision, watching him drown and whispering, "Not yet." He stood. The eviction notice fluttering from his fingers like dead skin. The bridge creaked beneath his boots as he turned back toward the city. There was no plan, no couch to crash on, just a long walk across cracked sidewalks and flickering street lamps. The kind of walk you only take when there's nothing left to lose. He was being broken open. He just didn't know it yet. The next morning, he woke on the floor of a borrowed apartment. A friend of a friend who let him crash for 2 nights, max. The heat barely worked. The window rattled. And the only blanket was a thin jacket that smelled like old cigarettes and worn-out hope. He washed his face in cold water and stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. "Who the hell are you?" he muttered. No answer, just the sound of the faucet dripping, drip, drip, like a slow countdown to something inevitable. He hit the pavement again. 17 job applications, no callbacks, a few polite "we'll get back to you" lies. But he could see it in their eyes. People avoided his gaze. The moment he mentioned he had no address, he ate lunch from a soup kitchen, watered down broth, a slice of white bread, and a paper cup of juice. He sat beside a man who spoke to invisible spirits and another who didn't speak at all. By sundown, he was back on the bridge, alone, cold, and tired of pretending. That night, the dream came. He stood in a circle of fire, not burning, glowing, protective, ancient around him. Tall figures, cloaked in light. No faces, just presence. He wasn't afraid, only exposed. Seen. One stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. The voice didn't speak out loud. It just entered him. "Everything that is not you must fall away. This is not abandonment, it is refinement." Daniel gasped and woke up in a cold sweat. He sat up straight, chest heaving, heart pounding. The apartment was still dark, still silent, but he could feel it. Something had shifted. The following days weren't easier. If anything, they got worse. The friend of a friend kicked him out when his girlfriend complained. He spent one night in a 24-hour laundromat, pretending to wait for clothes that didn't exist. Another night in the corner booth of a diner until the waitress asked him to leave. But the dream returned, each time deeper, more vivid. He saw himself walking barefoot through a desert, his old clothes turning to dust as he stepped forward. In the distance, a mountain made of mirrors. A voice called to him. The world is stripped from the chosen so they can walk into their name unburdened. He awoke with tears on his face. He didn't understand it, not fully, but some part of him, some primal, soul-deep part, recognized the truth. This wasn't misfortune. This was initiation. One day, he wandered into an old bookstore tucked between two boarded-up buildings. Inside, incense burned and soft chanting played on a radio. The shopkeeper, a woman with silver dreadlocks and eyes that seemed to know more than they let on, said nothing as he entered. He browsed, not knowing what he was looking for, until he saw it. A black-covered book with no title, just a symbol. A flame within a tear. He picked it up. The pages were handwritten. Dozens of quotes and reflections from mystics, prophets, poets, and wanderers who had lost everything only to find something greater. A sentence was underlined in red, "The chosen. One is always broken before they are built. Spirit burns away all that is false, wealth, fame, relationships, until only truth remains." His throat tightened. He bought it with his last $10. The shopkeeper looked him in the eyes for the first time. "You're right on time," she said. Nothing else. Daniel left without a word. The book clutched like a lifeline. Something ancient had finally blinked. The fire had started, and he was walking into it. The library steps were still wet from the morning rain when Daniel sat down with the book again. People passed around him like ghosts' umbrellas overhead, eyes glued to their phones, minds racing nowhere. The city was always in motion, but for Daniel, time had gone quiet, not frozen, but reverent, like the moment before a sacred song begins. He opened the book to the dog-eared page, fingers trembling slightly. The words greeted him not like information, but like remembrance. Suffering is not the enemy of the chosen. It is the sculptor. He didn't know how long he stared at that sentence, but it carved itself into his ribs. For the first time since, everything collapsed. He didn't want to escape the pain. He wanted to understand it. His entire life had been about striving, school, work, relationships, a desperate chase to prove himself worthy of belonging. But every time he reached the peak, it collapsed beneath him. Jobs disappeared, friendships soured, love withered, and every time he asked the same question, "Why me?" Now the silence had become an answer, not a cruel one, a sacred one. He was being cut away from the noise. That night, he didn't go back to the diner or the laundromat. Instead, he walked to a nearby park, the kind where broken benches sat beneath drooping oaks, and old lamps flickered like dying stars. He curled up under his jacket on the damp grass, the book tucked beneath his chest. He dreamed again. This time, he stood before a massive gate carved with fire. Symbols danced across the surface, ones he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. He stepped forward. The fire licked at his skin, not to burn him, but to cleanse. Inside the gate, a voice called out, not with words, but with recognition, "You are not poor. You are being purified." He woke up crying, not from sorrow, from clarity. In the days that followed, something changed in Daniel's presence. He still had no money, no home, but people began to see him. A woman at the coffee shop gave him a free sandwich without asking. An old man on the bus struck up a conversation and handed him a $10 bill for luck. A child stared at him and said, "You're shiny." And yet Daniel didn't feel above it all. He felt beneath something sacred, something vast. One morning, while walking past a mural of forgotten saints and burning suns, he whispered to the wind, "I surrender." It wasn't dramatic. There were no flashes of light or angelic choirs, but the air shifted. The silence didn't feel empty anymore, it felt inhabited. He spent that day in the public library, poring through ancient texts and spiritual journals. Stories of prophets, poets, monks, and mystics. All had walked through deserts. All had lost everything. All had been misunderstood, rejected, and stripped of comfort. Each one had emerged with the same fire in their eyes. Daniel scribbled notes furiously in the margins of a dollar store notebook. Initiation is not punishment. It is permission to see, to hear, to remember. It wasn't all clarity and beauty, though. That would have been too easy. Some days he felt the ache of hunger clawing at his ribs. Other nights he curled up on a cold bench and begged whatever force was guiding him to just stop testing him. Doubt crept in like rot. Maybe he'd imagined it all. Maybe the dreams were just his broken brain trying to find meaning in chaos. Then one night, under a pale sky littered with stars, a man approached him. He was tall, bearded, and draped in a simple gray shawl. No introduction, just a presence gum. Unshaken, "Is this seat taken?" the man asked, gesturing to the other side of the bench. Daniel shrugged. "All yours." They sat in silence for a long while. Then the man said, "You've begun, haven't you?" Daniel looked over, heart thudding. "Begun, what?" The man turned, eyes like ancient wells, the sacred unmaking, the path of the chosen. Daniel said nothing. The man nodded anyway. "Most don't make it past the stripping, but you're still here. That means something." Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "It hurts." "It's supposed to," the man replied. "You were born into illusion. Now you're being carved into something real." Daniel looked down. "I've lost everything." The man smiled gently. "No, you're losing what was never yours." "What was borrowed?" "False identities, temporary attachments. Those must fall away so your true self can rise." Silence. The man stood, slipping a small coin into Daniel's palm. On it was the same symbol from his dream, a flame inside a tear. "You're not alone, Daniel. We've all walked this path. The loneliness you feel, that's just the distance between who you were and who you're becoming." Then he walked away. Daniel sat frozen. When he finally looked up, the man was gone, just like in the dreams that night. Daniel held the coin in his palm and whispered the words he hadn't dared speak since his life unraveled. "Thank you." Not to the sky, not to the man, to the process. He began keeping a journal, not just of events, but of transformation. What changed inside him each day? What patterns he noticed? What he was being shown through suffering? His heart didn't feel lighter, but it felt deeper. He saw beauty in places he never noticed before. The way light pooled through storm clouds. The way people's pain peeked through their smiles. He no longer judged others as failures or fools. He saw in them the same fire sunk, just unlit, or covered in ashdod. And he knew this was his path, not to escape suffering, but to walk through it awake, to become a vessel not of wealth or fame or ease but of truth. One evening, as dusk bled into night, Daniel stood at the bridge where it all began. The city behind him was still glowing with its lies, but this time he saw through them, and more than that, he forgave them. He closed his eyes and placed the coin on the railing. "For whoever comes after me," he whispered, "may you walk through the fire and not be afraid." Behind him, the wind stirred like a whispered prayer. He wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but the refining had begun, and he was no longer afraid of the flame. The morning was wet with fog, and Daniel awoke to the sharp bite of cold on his cheeks. A light drizzle had settled over the city, making the world shimmer in shades of gray and silver. He had spent the night beneath the eaves of an abandoned church, curled up in his coat like a cocoon. But as he sat up and looked toward the sky, he felt it again, that strange stillness before a turning point. The dream from the night before still throbbed behind his eyes. He had been walking along a glass bridge suspended over a chasm. Below him, shadows twisted and whispered his name. At the far end of the bridge was a figure cloaked in light, arms outstretched. But every step Daniel took, the glass cracked. At the center, just before it gave way, he had asked the question out loud, "Am I worthy?" The voice from the light had answered, "You were never asked to be worthy. You were asked to be willing." He sat with that as the rain began to ease. Willing, the world didn't want a perfect man. It wanted one who would rise after falling, who would walk into the unknown even with trembling hands. The coin the man had given him stayed in his pocket, a constant reminder that the path wasn't just for him. It was ancient, generational. Chosen ones had walked barefoot through fire long before him. Saints, rebels, visionaries, madmen. All had faced the same question in different tongues. Will you keep going when it seems like God has stopped speaking? That day, Daniel ventured beyond the neighborhoods he knew, past the crumbling outskirts and graffiti-covered underpasses. Something pulled him toward the edge of the city, toward places people avoided. The air grew still the deeper he walked. And then, as if summoned, he saw it, a ragged sign half buried in ivy, "Sanctum House." The letters were faded, but the door was open. Inside, he found a hollowed-out community center. Dust floated through shafts of light like ghosts dancing between lives. Broken chairs, rusted filing cabinets, and torn flyers littered the space. But Daniel saw something else, a shape underneath the ruin. A circle of chairs, a ring of candles, long dead, a chalk symbol on the floor that tugged at something ancient in his gut. This had once been a meeting ground, a sanctuary. He knelt and brushed dust from the chalk. A spiral surrounded by 7 dots. He didn't know why, but his fingers moved on, their own tracing the shape as he did. The air shifted, warmer, thicker, charged. A whisper, almost inaudible, slid into his ear. "Welcome back." Daniel flinched, looking around. No one, but something else was in the room now. Not a person, a presence. His hands began to tingle. His chest burned not with pain, but recognition. He sat cross-legged within the spiral and closed his eyes. What followed was not a dream, it was a vision. He stood in a desert, empty and vast. Wind howled across the dunes, and the sun blazed without mercy. In the distance, a procession walked, figures in robes, faces hidden, each carrying a lantern that did not flicker. One by one, they passed Daniel. None looked at him until the last one stopped. This figure's lantern held not light but shadow. Black smoke curled inside it, alive and writhing. "Do you know what this is?" the figure asked, holding the lantern out. Daniel shook his head. "This is your pain, your loss, your poverty, your fear, and yet you carry it." The lantern was placed in Daniel's hands. It was heavier than he expected, warm like blood. The figure stepped back. "When the world casts you out, the sacred calls you in. This is the weight of becoming. Carry it until you understand it. Then let it carry you." And just like that, the vision shattered. He opened his eyes with a gasp. The sanctum house was quiet again, but something inside him had changed. The spiral still glowed faintly on the floor, and beneath him, nestled in the dust, was something he hadn't noticed before. A scroll, wrapped in crimson twine. Hands shaking, he opened it. The parchment held just one line: "To enter the next gate, you must give away what little you have." His heart twisted. What little he had, that was nothing. A coat, a book, a journal, the coin. How could he give away even that? But something deeper within him already knew. The chosen path required radical trust. Sacrifice, not for sufferings. Sakibut for transformation. The next day, he walked the streets with intent. He gave his coat to a shivering man huddled in a bus shelter. He left his notebook inside a church pew with a note: "Your story matters. Keep writing." He returned the book to the library with a letter inside, addressed to the next reader: "You're not broken. You're becoming." And the coin that was the hardest, he took it to the old bridge, the same one he had crossed on the day he left his old life behind. He stared at it in his palm for what felt like forever. The flame within the tear, his first symbol of hope. He kissed it. "Thank you for finding me," he whispered. "Now go find someone else." And he dropped it into the river below. As it vanished beneath the rippling surface, something released in his chest. Not grief, relief. That night, Daniel returned to the sanctum house. The spiral was gone, but in its place was a stone door embedded in the far wall, one he had somehow never seen before. No handle, no hinges, just an inscription: "You have nothing. Now you are ready." Without hesitation, Daniel placed his palm on the stone. It opened, and everything changed. The door creaked open, not with the sound of rust, but with breath like the earth itself exhaled as Daniel stepped through. On the other side, the air was warmer, alive with something ancient. He stood at the threshold of what could only be described as a temple carved directly into the heart of the earth. The walls pulsed with subtle veins of gold and obsidian, almost biological in nature, as though the place was alive and dreaming. Daniel hesitated only a second before stepping through. The stone closed silently behind him. There was no lock, no mechanism. There was simply no turning back. The room before him was vast and circular, lit by unseen sources of light. 7 columns rose from the ground to the domed ceiling, each carved with a different sigil, symbols he recognized not from books, but from his own dreams. He walked to the center, where a single cushion awaited, embroidered with a sunburst. He sat without instruction. Something told him that the temple would respond not to obedience, but to honesty. It was not a place for rehearsed prayers. It was a place for truth. At first, there was only silence, But it wasn't empty. It was full, saturated, and slowly, Daniel began to hear it, the inner noise. The roar of all he had carried abandonment, failure, shame. His stomach twisted. His fingers clenched into his palms. And then the voice came not from outside, but from deep within. "Why are you here?" he startled. But no one stood near. The voice was his own, and yet it wasn't. It came from a deeper layer of himself, the place he had buried beneath years of rejection. "I don't know," he whispered. "Then you are not ready." His chest tightened, but he didn't rise. He closed his eyes, fists shaking. "I came because everything else fell apart. I lost my friends. I lost my job. I lost my place in the world." "Those were not losses," the voice returned. "They were offerings. You let go of what was never yours to keep." Daniel breathed, slow and long. The silence around him thickened. "I came because I'm tired," he said, "of pretending, of hiding, of carrying this fire with nowhere to place it. And what do you want?" That question lodged in his throat. What did he want? He waited. He searched. "I want to remember who I am," he said finally, tears prickling at the edges of his eyes. "Not who they told me to be, not what they judged me as. Me, the one who came here before the world taught me to hate myself." Silence followed, then warmth. A pulse spread through the floor beneath him, radiating up into his spine like gentle lightning. The sigils on the pillars began to glow dimly at first, then brighter, one by one, until the entire chamber hummed with golden light. He opened his eyes, breath caught in awe, and there, standing across from him, was a figure cloaked in robes the color of midnight sky. The being's face was both ancient and young, male and female, human and divine. A paradox made flesh. "You have spoken your truth," the figure said, its voice layered like a chord played on a sacred instrument. "Now receive the first teaching." Daniel rose to his feet, unsteady but willing. The figure gestured to the 7 pillars. "Each of these represents a part of you, a part of the journey of the chosen. Few survive this far because most resist the initiation, but you have surrendered." "I didn't know I was surrendering," Daniel admitted. The figure smiled, and that is why it counted. They walked together around the circle. The figure touched the first pillar. "This is severance, the breaking away from the life you thought was yours. Your loneliness, your poverty, your exile, they were all part of this severing. You passed through it, not by force, but by fire." Daniel looked up at the pillar. It shimmered, showing images from his past, his apartment emptying out. The look on his former friend's face as he said, "I just don't get you anymore." The nights spent alone, wondering if he had imagined the whole calling. "You didn't," the figure said, as though reading his thoughts. The second pillar was stillness. "This is where you are now," the figure explained. "No more running, no more striving, only silence, only listening." "I don't know how to be still," Daniel confessed. "That is why you must remain here," the figure replied, "until the next gate opens of its own." The third pillar shimmered faintly. It was remembrance. The fourth, fire. The fifth, vision. The sixth, burden. And the seventh, looming tallest of all, was simply return. Daniel stared up at it, something inside him stirring like a buried seed, pushing toward light. "This is all just the beginning?" he asked. "Yes," the figure said. "Initiation is never the end. It is the death of illusion, the beginning of power, rooted not in control, but in surrender. But I have nothing. You have everything. The figure stepped closer, and for a moment, Daniel saw himself reflected in its eyes, not as he was, but as he could be, strong, grounded, illuminated from within. You are the temple, the figure said. You are the flame. This is the world that chose you, not to dominate it, not to fix it, but to carry light through it. Even when your hands are empty, even when your voice shakes. Tears fell freely now. Daniel didn't wipe them away. What happens now? He asked. The figure placed a hand over his heart. You wait, and with that, the figure dissolved into mist. Daniel remained seated in the temple for what could have been hours or days. There was no time there, only being. He began to understand that the poverty of his outer world had mirrored the necessary clearing of his inner one, that the loneliness he felt was not a punishment, but a silence spacious enough to hear, the voice that had been drowned out for years. He was alone, and yet not. He was broke, and yet rich in clarity. He was still, and yet deeply, profoundly moving within. And when he finally rose, the stone door behind him opened once more. He stepped out into a world unchanged, but he was not the same. Man Daniel returned to the outer world, not with triumphant fire, but with quiet embers. The city greeted him the way it always had, buzzing, indifferent, vast, but something in him had shifted. The cold wind no longer pierced him like before. The glares from passers-by no longer unsettled him. Even the absence of money in his wallet didn't register as panic. Hunger grumbled in his belly, but he greeted it like an old companion. Everything that once screamed failure had been retranslated inside him. He was poor, yes, but only in coin. In spirit, he had never been. Richer, he walked aimlessly, guided not by destination, but by feeling. There was no divine voice directing his steps, only intuition, quiet and humble, like the whisper of leaves in a still forest. The temple had spoken of stillness, and now that stillness had taken root in him, he could feel the pull of his thoughts and fears trying to drag him back into the noise. But something inside him had grown heavier, no longer easily swept away. He wandered past familiar blocks, the closed-down cafe where he used to write, the bench he once slept on during a rainstorm, the old community hall where he'd once volunteered as a teenager. The memories rose, not as hauntings, but as echoes, threads in a story that finally made sense. Pain had not come to destroy him. It had come to shape him. Still, the world did not bend in reverence to his inner shift. By nightfall, his body ached from walking, and the ache in his stomach became harder to ignore. He passed a bakery, its warmth and scent spilling onto the street like an invitation. He paused, gazing through the glass. Rows of golden bread and sweet rolls lined the shelves, but he had nothing, not a single coin. A woman stepped out with a bag in hand and glanced at him just a second too long. Pity flickered across her face. Then she turned away and walked off. Daniel lowered his gaze. He felt the old shame rising, hot and fast. This is what it means to be chosen, to starve in front of a feast, to live invisible while others pass by with excess. He closed his eyes. The temple's voice returned. Stillness, he exhaled. Instead of walking away, he sat on the edge of the pavement, back against the wall, hands resting in his lap, not begging, not performing sorrow, just being. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then hey. Daniel looked up. A young man stood over him, hoodie pulled low, a bag in hand. He looked nervous. "I saw you sit here earlier. Thought maybe you could use something." He held out the bag. Daniel took it gently. "Thank you." The young man nodded, then added, "You looked peaceful. I don't see that a lot. Not around here." He walked off before Daniel could answer. Inside the bag were 2 still warm rolls, wrapped in brown paper. Simple, perfect. Sacred. Daniel didn't weep. He smiled, because the world had finally spoken back, not with miracles, but with mirrors. He had changed, and now the world was beginning to reflect it. That night, he slept beneath the old train overpass, his usual place, but the cold didn't bite the same way. In his pocket, he still carried the cloth satchel from the temple. Within it was the piece of bark he had pocketed instinctively, now glowing with a faint, golden shimmer. He held it in his hand before sleep took him and dreamed. In the dream, he stood on a bridge of obsidian over a river of fire. On the other side waited 7 figures, each wearing a mask shaped like different emotions: joy, sorrow, rage, fear, wonder, pride, and despair. "You must cross," they said in unison. "But the fire will burn me," Daniel replied. "That is the point." He stepped forward. With each step, the fire licked higher, not just around his feet, but inside his chest. Every unshed tear, every buried scream, every memory he'd swallowed it, all ignited. He saw the moment his father left, the nights his mother cried herself to sleep, the first time a friend betrayed him, the last time he believed in a lie, just to feel wanted. He didn't run, he didn't resist. He walked through the burning. By the time he reached the other side, the masks had vanished, only mirrors remained. He looked into one and saw himself not as the boy he'd been or the man he'd tried to become, but as something new, something ancient, a flame in human skin, a path in motion. He woke before sunrise. The dream clung to him like smoke, but its meaning was clear. Initiation wasn't about being lifted out of darkness. It was about walking straight into it and surviving with your light intact. The next few days unfolded quietly but meaningfully. Daniel began spending his mornings sitting in the park, not asking for anything, just being. A few strangers began to take notice. Some sat with him, some cried beside him. One elderly man simply placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder and said, "You have a calming presence." At night, he returned to the overpass. It was still cold, still hard, but it was home for now. One evening, a man in a tailored suit found him there. "You're the one people are talking about," he said. "The guy who just listens. No judgment, no preaching, just presence." Daniel nodded. "That's me." The man offered a card. "I run a center for youth in crisis. We could use someone like you. Just your stillness." Daniel looked down at the card. "I'm not sure I'm ready." "No one is," the man replied. "But readiness and willingness aren't the same." He left the card and walked away. Daniel turned it over in his hand. The name of the center was The Bridge. Just like in his dream, he didn't go the next day or the day after. He went when it felt right, not because he needed a job, but because he had become a lighthouse for others still lost in storm. By the end of the week, Daniel stood before the center's entrance. He took a breath, felt the temple within him stir, and stepped through. This was not the end of his struggle. It wasn't the end of his poverty. It wasn't even the end of his loneliness. But it was the beginning of something truer. He was no longer a man lost in the dark, waiting to be rescued. He was the fire they tried to extinguish. He was the silence that carried power. He was the chosen one, not because he was better, but because he had been broken open, and through the cracks, the light had poured in. The air in the youth center was thick with unspoken grief and silent desperation. Daniel could feel it the moment he crossed the threshold, like walking through fog made of sorrow. No one looked up as he entered. A few teens sat slumped on worn couches, others hunched over plastic tables, earbuds in, eyes vacant. Staff moved quietly, dutifully. It was a place of refuge, but not yet of healing. Daniel didn't rush in with answers. He sat, he watched, he listened in the temple. They had taught him the ancient art of presence, how to anchor without control, to witness without judgment. Now, he let the teachings guide him. He spent hours in the corner of the room, a quiet shadow, neither aloof nor invasive. The first few days, no one approached. But on the fourth day, a girl with knotted braids and bruised wrists sat beside him on the floor and whispered, "I don't want to feel invisible anymore." He didn't speak, he just placed his hand over hers. That was enough. Word spread. Not in the loud way of viral stories, but in the way embers spread in dry grass, low, steady, alive. The teens began to drift toward him in small groups, then one by one. Some asked questions, some cried, some just sat in silence. He offered no sermons, no advice, no false hope, only the sacred gift of presence. For the first time in his life, Daniel understood what it meant to be chosen, not by a council, not by fate, but by pain, by fire, by the journey through shadow. Every trial he had endured, the loneliness, the poverty, the rejection, had not been punishments. They were the initiation rites of a path few could walk. The chosen one's path was not one of glory or applause. It was one of depth, of service, of becoming the very medicine the world didn't know it needed. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the dusty blinds, the director of the center, Mr. Reyes, sat down beside him. "I don't know what you're doing," he said slowly, "but the kids, they're changing. They're calmer, more open. We've had fewer fights this week than we've had in months." Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm not doing anything. They're just remembering who they are." Mr. Reyes shook his head. "You speak like a monk." Daniel chuckled. "I was trained by silence, not monks." A beat of silence passed between them. "Whatever it is," Reyes said, "we want you here, officially. I can't offer much, barely enough to cover rent, but it's something." Daniel looked out the window. He thought of the overpass, the nights spent shivering, the weeks without food. He thought of the dream, the bridge, the river of fire, and he nodded. "I'll stay." With time, Daniel began to shape quiet spaces inside the center corners where kids could sit without pressure to speak. Rooms where sound was softened and lighting was gentle. He taught them to breathe, not with the forced rigor of discipline, but as a form of remembering. He never called it meditation. He just invited them to feel their feet on the ground, to notice their breath. That was all. Healing crept in like morning mist, slow, subtle, sacred. But the world outside remained loud, and one day it came knocking. A journalist from a local paper had heard about the homeless guy turning lives around at the youth center. She came in with a notepad and sharp questions. Daniel, at first, declined. but the teens asked him to share. They wanted their stories to be heard anonymously, of course, but seen, validated. So he spoke not of miracles, but of the mundane holiness of simply surviving. The article went viral. Suddenly, people wanted interviews, podcasts, television spots. Offers flooded in, book deals, speaking gigs, branded courses. Some praised him as a saint. Others accused him of faking humility. Daniel declined it all because he knew the true chosen one is not chosen to be seen. They are chosen to see. Months passed, winter came. The city blanketed in white dot. Daniel now lived in a small apartment near the center, modest, warm enough. He kept the cloth satchel from the temple on a shelf near his bed. Inside it, the bark still glowed faintly, only when held. Sometimes he would stare at it and smile, not because he needed its magic, but because it reminded him of the moment he had first chosen himself. One evening, a teen named Zeke stormed into the center, fists clenched, face streaked with tears. He had been beaten at home again, but this time he had fought back. "I'm not like you," he shouted at Daniel. "You're calm, peaceful. I'm full of rage. I can't carry this the way you do." Daniel took his hands gently. "I wasn't born peaceful," he said. "I had to burn for years to get here." Zeke looked at him, breath-catching. "Then, teach me." Daniel nodded and began. In time, others came, some from across the city, some from far beyond, not because of the article, but because they had felt something they couldn't explain, a pull, a calling. They didn't know why, but they knew where to go. They came to sit with the fire, and the fire welcomed them. Daniel never became famous. He never led a movement, but he became something rarer, a sanctuary, a place in human form. He once thought his poverty was a curse, that his loneliness was a failure, that his rejection meant he was unworthy. Now he knew all of it had been the initiation to strip him down, to hollow him out so he could hold others. The chosen one's path was not to rise above the world, but to descend into its darkest rooms and light a single flame, enough for someone else to find their way. Years later, a new youth abandoned, cold, bitter would find himself standing at the door of the center. Daniel, older now, would greet him not with wisdom, but with presence. No sermon, just a seat, a hand, and the quiet knowing, "You're not broken, you're becoming." And so the fire would continue, past not with thunder, but with stillness, from chosen one to chosen one, a lineage not of blood, but of becoming. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever felt alone, broke, forgotten, know this: you are not abandoned. You are awakening. You are in the fire of your own becoming. This isn't the end of your story. It's the initiation. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone walking through the dark, thinking they're lost when really they're being forged. And if you are the chosen one, quietly carrying the weight of what others can't see, then let this be your reminder. You were handpicked for something sacred. Now rise. Subscribe for more soul-deep stories. Leave a comment. Your story might be the torch for someone else. And remember, the world doesn't need another hero. It needs someone who remembers who they are.